Everyone would like to live a day in ancient Rome, but at least to know what it was like. Certainly, in our videos, we periodically analyze the lives of people from different professions and time periods, but most often it is someone famous like legionaries, Spartans, or samurai. We decided to go back to the roots and conduct a small experiment, namely to live a day in the skin of the most ordinary people in different cities of antiquity. We will start, of course, with Rome and focus not on representatives of romantic professions, but on the simplest workers with the most typical lives. How do you like this idea, friends? Leave your opinion in the comments. And if it is positive, don't forget to specify the city you would like to go to next. Well, we are transported to ancient Rome in 75 AD. Emperor Vespasian is sitting on the throne. Syria has just become a Roman province, and life, after the tyranny of Nero and the Great Fire of Rome 10 years ago, finally got better. So much so that Vespasian decided to placate people by building a majestic Colosseum, which would later be called the New Wonder of the World. Actually, our protagonist, Vincenzo Moretti, works on the construction of the amphitheater. The guy works as an ordinary bricklayer, being a representative of the middle class and a typical resident of Rome. Together with him, we will live one day, which starts right at dawn. Before the invention of electricity 1,500 years ago, every minute of the daylight hours was used to the maximum by people of antiquity. Our Vincenzo will wake up on one of the upper floors of an insula, the so-called apartment buildings, where most of the population of ancient Rome lived. Yeah. The Romans also had apartment buildings. They came to replace mansions and individual houses in the times of the Republic, somewhere in the 3rd century BC. Of course, because of the constant increase in the population of Rome. Initially, the number of floors and buildings was chaotic, but over time, the same type of 2- and 4-story houses with small apartments and very similar to communes were formed. The upper floors were usually inhabited by the poor and the lower floors by the richer people. The reason was simple, because often the floors above were built in a shoddy manner on top of the existing ones, and water supply and sewerage almost never reached there. Rome also had a modern habit of having stores on the first floors of its high-rise buildings. Insulas by 150 BC in Rome were several tens of thousands, and they were a sight to behold. Poor people from the upper floors could easily throw their fecal matter into the street. Fighting and stabbings were commonplace, and people lived in constant fear. The lack of intelligent planning and the greed of developers who built new floors meant that the construction and its materials were not safe. Being largely wooden, they often collapsed, more often flooded, and more often burned. The apogee was the Great Fire of Rome, which in the 64th year devastated 11 of the city's 14 quarters, largely due to dilapidation and close proximity to each other. After this, Emperor Nero decided to widen the streets to insulae farther away, and balconies were built on the upper floors to provide access in an emergency. Later, Emperor Trajan would try to limit the height of the insulae, but he would not succeed. Well, our Moretti was born to live in such an insula, and he certainly does not care about high reasoning. Unfortunately, there is no exact data on how the ancient Romans woke up. Although the alarm clock had already been invented and water clocks had the same name, there is no data on their widespread use in all estates. Historians are inclined to believe that it is us in modern times who are lazy, and our Vincenzo in ancient Rome was awakened by the hum that began in the street before dawn. There was no soundproofing in the insulas, and the shouting in the narrow streets woke him up better than the infernal alarm clock of an iPhone. And Vincenzo had no desire to lie on the bed, because there was no bed. Poor people slept on parallelepipes made of bricks, on which they laid a mattress stuffed with dried grass. You can read in books and articles that the Romans revered food, had separate dining rooms, and respected family rituals. Unfortunately, this doesn't really apply to working people. There is nothing in our Vincenzo's room, and he runs outside for breakfast. All classes had a light first meal, and to the Roman builders, we owe the appearance of the famous cereolette, buns that were first prepared in bakeries at dawn. They were bought up by builders, like our Vincenzo, to have a snack on the way to work, just like modern office workers buy coffee at Starbucks. And this is not an exaggeration, because fast food in ancient Rome not only existed, but was almost more widespread than now. But more on that later. And now our Vincenzo, having had a snack of cereolette with diluted wine, is preparing to build the Colosseum. The mason's job has been the same for centuries, so we'll focus on other things. For example, the working day in ancient Rome rarely exceeded 6 hours, and it is very likely that by lunchtime our Moretti will be free. It is possible that the next day we will not need to work at all, because the Roman calendar is a fascinating thing. The working week consisted not of 7, but of 8 days. The last one was called Nundinalia denier and was considered a day off for everyone except merchants. At first sight, it's worse than it is now, but this is where the Roman magic begins. The guys had a complex system of holidays and auspicious days for work. It is still being deciphered, and historians put forward conflicting versions. The German scientist Mommsen states that the calendar consisted of 239 days suitable for work. All others were either unfavorable or so-called black days. These are anniversaries of catastrophes, military defeats, and inclement weather in Rome, on which it was customary to mourn and in no case to work. And, in fact, there were still holidays that the emperors could declare at will. Despite the differences in different versions of calendars, almost all scientists agree that on average only 2 out of 3 days were working. In general, our Moretti rests certainly more than we do, and after a 6-hour working day, on average an hour or 2, Vincenzo is already free. The first thing he will almost certainly do is visit a Roman bath. After all, you have not forgotten that the middle class has nothing at home, and yet hygiene was a favorite in Rome. Baths were also considered a place of socialization, communication, and leisure. Affluent people played sports before them, but our Moretti has enough sport at work. Perhaps after the bath, he will pick up the necessary goods at the markets, which are about to close. After that, Vincenzo, like the rest of the population of Rome, regardless of wealth, will prepare for dinner, the main meal of the day, which begins around 4 p.m. And dinner could last 3 or 4 hours. In wealthy, large families, it served as a way of unity, and for the poor, it provided entertainment and leisure. After all, they could not organize dinners at home and went back to eating in eateries.
This video is brought to you by Thorum. Take a look at these rings. They have rings made from 4 billion-year-old Gibeon meteorite and genuine 65 million-year-old T-Rex bone. If you are a fan of Vikings, they have Odin ring, the Norse god of war, the Thor ring, and all of them are crafted by hand. Head the link in the comments and use promo code LIVINGHISTORY to get 20% off a truly unique ring.
Here we will return to the topic of fast food. The overwhelming part of the middle and poor class could not afford expensive cooking at home and meals, so they gathered in diners. Simply put, they were almost no different from modern ones. A marble counter facing the street with heated cauldrons of food, few tables inside, noise, and democratic prices. People either sat at the counter or occupied a table and had fun besides eating. No wonder, for the quality there was so-so. Being establishments of a low price category, they sold mostly simple chowder, olives, fish soups, and very poor analogues of borscht, which, by the way, was the national dish of Rome. True, it was mostly vegetable, as the poor saw meat on holidays. Instead, our Vincenzo more often ate boiled beans. They both perfectly filled the lack of protein in the body and were very popular because health problems from a poor diet among the poor were common. It is quite possible that Moretti would hit the dice with someone, have a couple of glasses of wine, and lose part of his paycheck in gambling. Also, in eateries, they often staged mini-theatrical productions and hired dancers to placate the public. Ancient Rome in this regard is frighteningly similar to modern times because there were advertising signs, frescoes, and even poets who were often hired to call in the institution verses. These eateries were open till night, and Moretti might spend the whole evening there. Although there are alternatives, perhaps there are games or gladiator fights going on somewhere nearby, perhaps there's a theater production or a public speaker nearby. Cultural entertainment was almost always very cheap, and everyone could afford it. After all, the emperors are not fools, and realize that the poor will not be a problem as long as they are cheerful and in a good mood. Otherwise, you can get an uprising. Speaking of getting, salaries in ancient Rome are wildly difficult to calculate, largely because a huge part of the work was done by slaves, and emperors reprinted coins in their honor too often. But it is more than likely that our Vincenzo receives somewhere around 40 sesterces a month. To rent a tiny apartment goes for somewhere around 15-20 sesterces, and you have to pay almost every day. Only the rich paid by the month or even once a year, while the poor, clever landlords preferred to take money from the poor almost every day. This was another cause for fear, for in addition to the destruction of the house, the poor were also afraid of eviction. Our Vincenzo, fortunately, is not threatened by this and has 25 sesterces left for the month. This, in turn, is 100 asses. That is about 3 or 4 per day. With 1 ace, you could buy half a liter of pure wine, make 4 trips to the bath, or purchase a kilogram of bread. It's enough to live on, but you'll have to save up for a good Moretti tunic. They cost about 15 sesterces, which is almost as much as a month's rent. So our Vincenzo went with something simple, and even after buying a beautiful tunic, he wore it not so often. In general, this is the essence of life of a simple man in ancient Rome. You don't have to starve, because in addition to inexpensive eateries, there are also free establishments sponsored by the Reich. The food there is worse, but there is no question of starvation, except for health, as the lower classes rarely saw meat, and only the clever ones could substitute beans for it. Also, the living conditions were so poor with the constant risk of house collapse or eviction. On the other hand, there were more than accessible baths, even more accessible entertainment, and quite accessible gladiator fights and games. Is it enough to call the life of simple workers of ancient Rome good? It's up to you to decide, and we are waiting for the answer in the comments, as well as your feedback on the new section on the proposals of other cities where you would like to live a day in antiquity. See you again, mates.